Consciousness is a complex phenomena, including different dimensions of which time and space perception play a vital role. However, our neural signals also have their own temporal and spatial distribution, and how these play an important role in emergence of consciousness. We have today with us Dr. George Northoff, who is a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, and also a philosopher. On behalf of Center for Consciousness Studies, I welcome Dr. George Northoff wholeheartedly for the keynote. So you're heartily welcome. To chair this prestigious keynote, we are very much honored to have two eminent personalities with us. Our Director of National Institute for Mental Health and Neurosciences, a renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Pratima Murthy. Madam, we welcome you. And Dr. Indra Devi is a professor of neurosurgery from NIMHANS, Bangalore. Madam, we welcome you. Dr. Pratima Murthy, who heads the prestigious NIMHANS, that is National Institute for Mental Health and Neurosciences, the Institute of National Importance, the one and only institute in India and this part of the globe, which have all the state-of-art facilities for the neuroscience work, has 30 years of experience with exceptional accomplishments in the field of mental health. She is well recognized, exceptional leader in addiction psychiatry. Recently, she was honored by WHO Regional Director's Special Recognition Award on World No Tobacco Day for her remarkable services in tobacco control. She has been instrumental in establishing the state-of-art Center of Addiction Medicine at NIMHANS. Madam has served as a consultant to most prestigious organizations like United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, International Labour Organization, and WHO. She has also served as a resource person for various flagship training programs in substance abuse, prevention and tobacco cessation in the country and across the globe. She has also been recognized for her contribution for improving care for persons with mental illness through her work in the National Human Rights Commission on quality assurance on mental health care in institutions and also in the community. In recognition for her research and academic excellence, she has been bestowed with various honors and awards. The most prestigious Dr. Raja Ramanna Award by the Government of Karnataka, Lifetime Achievement Award from Rotary, and she is also a prolific author with innumerable amount of publications, books, and various articles. And she is also a fellow of Royal College of Physicians of Glasgow. So I welcome you, Madam, for this keynote. We have with us Dr. Indra Devi. She is a professor of neurosurgery at NIMHANS, Bangalore. Very well being recognized in the field of neurosurgery, especially her contribution in craniovertebral junction anomalies, surgeries for gliomas, right, and also about the spinal dysparism and in the management of hemorrhage and cerebral ischemia, and also in traumatic brain injuries. And she has been collaborating extensively throughout the globe, especially with the University of Cambridge in the research in neurotrauma. And she is also a member of Global Neurosurgery in World Federation of Neurosurgery. And she has the hundreds of publications for her credit in her areas of interest. And in this keynote, we also have with us Dr. Bindu M. Kutti. She is a professor of neurophysiology and officer in charge for the Center for Consciousness Studies, and her contribution, especially in assessing the effect of meditation on sleep and cognition and the neural repair mechanism, has been very well recognized all over the globe. So with these few words, I hand over this keynote for the chairperson.
Thank you very much. And along with my distinguished co-chair, Professor Indra Devi, It's a great pleasure to be chairing this very, very important keynote address. I think since yesterday, it's been a kind of real feast in terms of listening to all the various academic deliberations and really being inquisitive about this whole concept of consciousness. And today's lecture is another insight into this very intriguing and mysterious phenomenon of consciousness. We have Dr. George Northoff, who is a philosopher, neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Northoff is the ELJB-CIHR Michael Smith Chair in Neurosciences and Mental Health and holds a CIHR Canada Research Chair, Tier 1, in Mind-Brain Imaging and Neuroethics at the University of Ottawa Institute of Mental Health Research at the Royal. He addresses the basic questions such as why and how our brain constructs subjective phenomena like self, consciousness, and emotions. Dr. Northoff is a transdisciplinary scholar with worldwide collaborations. He has published more than 350 original papers and more than 28,000 citations and published 21 books translated into several languages, like The Spontaneous Brain, From the Mind-Body to the World-Brain Problem, Neurophilosophy and the Healthy Mind, Learning from the Unwell Brain, and Unlocking the Brain. Dr. Northoff researches the relationship between the brain and mind, focusing on the philosophy, neuroimaging, pathophysiology, psychopathology, and biochemical mechanisms related to higher brain order functions like consciousness and self in both healthy people and in those with such mental illnesses like depression and schizophrenia. His work exploring the brain-mind connection has had global impact in the field of mental health and provides us a better understanding of our mental features like self and consciousness. He emphasizes the need to integrate neuroscience and philosophy and is the proponent of the non-reductive neurophilosophy. Exploring the neural mechanisms of mental features like self or consciousness brings in invariable conceptual issues like the definition and model of that explores the model to understand non-reductive neurophilosophy, which addresses these issues. We're honored to have Dr. Northoff giving this keynote today on his theory of consciousness, temporospatial theory of consciousness. And I think it's great to have a neurosurgeon and a psychiatrist and a person who's a neuroscientist, philosopher, and psychiatrist to actually participate in this session, which I'm sure is going to be great to listen to. Over to you, Professor Northoff.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And indeed, it's for me also a big honor, particularly to give a talk via Zoom to your country where there's such a strong tradition of consciousness. And yeah, so let me just share my screen. Let me get my slides here together. And yeah, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. Perfect. Then, okay, then I have to push you to the side. I'm sorry. So, okay, yeah. So my talk is about consciousness, and as already indicated, it will be really right at the interface between philosophy and neuroscience, also psychiatry, because I think it's deeply necessary to get a grip on this. And we developed over the years our own ideas of consciousness and its more general mental features. And here, the most basic ingredients of nature are key for us, mainly time and space. And basically my talk can be just understood as an exploration of time and space of the brain, how that relates the brain to the mind, mental features. And the key question I'm really asking here is really, how can neuronal activity transform into mental activity? You see, the way I erase this question already sets a certain direction. So I'm not looking for neuronal correlates of mental features, but I look for what makes it possible that neuronal activity transforms into mental activity. So here, my idea, this is just an overview, sort of, we developed this temporal spatial theory of consciousness. And I'm very grateful that I actually can present as part of this conference both empirical and ontological aspects, which usually obviously is not possible. So I'm very grateful for that, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. And we developed that over the years and various books and blah, 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 blah. So let me give you a brief overview of my talk. So first, I start with the conceptual domain, because I think if we do not have the conceptual framework clear, we will have problems on the empirical side. So, and here, one key issue in our current discussion of consciousness in both philosophy of mind and neuroscience, that they still assume that consciousness is special. I will contrast this with the assumption of the non-specialness of consciousness. Then in the second part down here, I will bring in some empirical mechanism, temporal spatial mechanism, linking world, brain, and consciousness. So that really goes into some empirical detail. I might skip over some of that in the service of time. And really meaning I provide some empirical meat to the conceptual bones. And the third will be then the more philosophical part. What are the ontological implications of such a model conceptual approach in the empirical mechanism for consciousness? Because my claim will be, it will require a particular form of ontology, which probably for you in the Eastern world and the Indian world is probably very familiar, meaning a relation-based ontology, rather than just as much in the Anglo-American and Western world, an entity-based ontology. So that may sound all very abstract to you at this point in time. I hope at the end of my talk, there may be a little bit glimpse of light to that. So let me start with the first part, the theoretical background. And that's really key. So, and here I say basically what you can say in Western philosophy and neuroscience, and I explicitly say Western here, because I don't know so much your own traditions in the Indian philosophy, but I don't think that you presuppose this kind of, that consciousness is so special in the universe. So let me sketch this a little bit in a visual. So you, of course, you all know in the Western tradition, René Descartes, beginning of the 16th century, he said, okay, there's a mind, and we cannot observe the mind from the outside as we can observe the body. So, and henceforth, he assumed the body is non-special, but the mind is special. And then he also assumed, okay, in addition, because we cannot observe, we assume that there's some special substance underlying the mind, a mental substance as distinguished from the physical substance of the body. And that's basically really characterized the mind as special compared to the body. And my key claim is that that assumption of specialness, which is sort of a methodological, epistemological claim, if you want to say so, with huge ontological implications, has been preserved in current neuroscience. So we still say, okay, the mind, the mental features, consciousness is special compared to unconscious. So then we look for special neuronal correlates of consciousness as distinguished, principally distinguished from the neuronal correlates of the unconscious or the non-conscious. Yeah, and that you can really see, and I will explicate it a little bit more in detail in the context of the current debate. Of course, now the neuroscientists, we say, no, we are not Cartesian. We overcame Descartes. Now we locate the mind in the brain, and it's no longer as distinguished. However, it still is, because now you just say, okay, there's some special neuronal feature which principally distinguished the neuronal mechanism underlying consciousness from all those underlying non-consciousness. And that is the claim I'm going against. So let me specify this claim, this presupposition of specialness, which, as I said, philosophically speaking, is sort of a methodological, epistemological claim. So you see in the current philosophy, based on, there's a lot of distinction between reflective and phenomenal consciousness, phenomenal features, reflective, often higher order, and then, of course, non-consciousness is non-special. In psychology, borderline to philosophy, it's net block, access consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness. And in the neuroscience, You have this sort of division also between global neuronal workspace theory, recurrent processing theory is Victor Lamme, a higher order thought theory, which are more sort of the reflective component of the access consciousness. IIT, integrated information theory, claims to be more for the phenomenal features. However, the specialness is still preserved. It's just divided into two sub-aspects of specialness, but the dichotomy to what is non-conscious is still preserved. And that's what I try to visualize here. Then here, philosophy is, of course, non-conscious, psychology is unconscious processing, and here, I think many of the excellent theories by Carl Friston, predictive coding, free energy, come in here, which are basically, and he says this himself, are theories of the brain activity, are not theories of consciousness. Yeah. So, of course, and the question is, how do you get this link? Because after all, these are phenomena as part of the brain as a whole. And I think that's a problem. There's really a dichotomy within the brain itself, if you take a more conceptual view. So meaning there's a principal difference. Yeah, integration in the integrated information is principally different from non-integration down here, and so forth. So the specialness of consciousness is still preserved in the current neuroscience and also in current philosophy of mind. Paradigmatic example is the heart problem. David Chalmers, same thing. So, and you see here is an oversight of a recent paper. We wrote some review of all the different theories of consciousness, and most of them are really, the specialness is preserved. I don't want to go into detail about that. Yeah. So the question for me, because after all, what do we need to do? We need to embed and integrate the seemingly special neuronal mechanism of consciousness within the non-special neuronal features of the brain as a whole. Yeah. Otherwise, we have the dichotomy, the dualism, the Cartesian dualism now transforms into a neuronal dualism. And I think that's the situation in the current neuroscience and also philosophy of mind. So just I try to sketch a different approach. Maybe instead of remember, I had this previous slide, I put in difference. Now I put in what do they share? Maybe these are not as special as we think. Maybe just specific particular matters of degree, but it's not a principal difference to the non-conscious. So maybe what do they share? And you will see this, my whole talk is about what does neuronal activity as such share with phenomenal or mental activity. So I look for the similarity rather than for the difference. So, and where do I look? So this is where I come to the basic constituents of the brain and of nature in general, as I would say. So I'm search for what is similar and shared by brain and mind, and I call that the common currency. So it's like a common currency that allows brain and mind, and ultimately also world, brain and mind, to talk with each other. It's like English. I do not speak Hindi. I cannot do that. You do not speak German. Maybe you studied in Germany, then you probably speak German. However, but the English is the common currency. So that allows me to transform my ideas into some of your thoughts, hopefully. Yeah. And so that is meaning what is shared between us makes possible our exchange, and slash that some of my ideas are transformed into yours. So, and where can we find this? This is a beautiful quote by Nikola Tesla, which is an inventor at the end of the 19th century. And of course, you know, Elon Musk, he named his company for the cars according to Tesla. And I highly recommend to look into Google under Tesla. It's a very interesting person, quite eccentric, very interesting, probably very, very clever guy. So this beautiful quote is from him. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. So these are basic features of temporal dynamics. Yeah. And that is exactly what we published last year in this paper 2020. Is temporal spatial dynamics the common currency, the shared feature of brain and mind? So, and this is basically this is basically now you can basically stop listening and say, God, I'm not interested in this. The rest of the talk is just an explication of this. So then, so going back, it's a similarity for brain and mind, search for the shared features. So what they share, it's a common currency, and that is the temporal spatial dynamics. And what do I mean? I don't need to tell you, because with your Indian context, you know what I mean by temporal dynamics. It's like waves. You have faster waves, you have slower waves in the seaside, which obviously you have a lot over there. And the bigger waves, the slower waves are usually more powerful. The faster waves are smaller and not as powerful. And exactly, you have the same in the brain too. You have different oscillations, you have waves, and you have this different frequency. For the experts among you, infraslow, 0.01 hertz, that's where you measure fMRI. You have faster frequency like gamma, 40 hertz and faster. Yeah, and also these waves down here, the infraslow stuff is more powerful, which hopefully goes away, and these are less powerful. So these are basic dynamic principles which also operate in nature, and they also operate within the brain. And that's the key point. Yeah, that's the key point. I say consciousness is nothing special. It is based on the most basic features of nature, like how nature constitutes its own time and space in temporal dynamics. And you see here, if you decompose, this is a raw signal, and if you decompose, you get all these features. So basically what I say, the common currency is a spatial topography of the brain, how it organizes its own space, the relationship between the different regions, for instance, and its temporal dynamics, meaning the changes from time point to time point. Yeah, not just each time point by itself, but the change, the relative change from time point to time point. In one of my earlier books, I spoke of different space coding. So, and I say that such a conceptual background carries huge empirical and ontological implications. And that's what I now basically want to flesh out a little bit. So this leads me to the second part of my talk, meaning the empirical realization of such a spatial temporal dynamic. And I will bring you now concrete study example how spatial topography and temporal dynamics are related to consciousness, or at least give a glimpse of that. And that's the empirical version of our temporal spatial theory of consciousness. And afterwards, I switch to the more philosophical implications. Yeah, so for the empirical part, we developed this, what we call temporal spatial theory of consciousness, TTC, empirical realization. And you see, I have a program here. This is published 2017. We will have another update 2021 next year, or this year. Sorry, I'm out of time, as you can see. That's why I've probably researched time and space. And two key features now, this is more the empirical part, is that we try to bridge the gaps between the spontaneous and the stimulus-related activity, which are often considered in a dichotomous way in neuroscience, which is a real problem. And then, obviously, we try to bridge the gap between neuronal and phenomenal features. Meaning, if as a philosopher, you somehow want to locate this TTC within the landscape, it's a neuronal theory about temporal spatial mechanism in the brain. But at the same time, it is also a neurophenomenal theory about neurophenomenal hypothesis, how specific temporal spatial mechanisms on the neuronal level are related to temporal spatial features of phenomenal features like ipseity, unity, intentionality, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, the latter part is in development, and I try to indicate that. Going back, as I said, going back to the very basics of the neuronal activity, spatial topography, temporal dynamic, meaning how does the brain create its own inner time and space? So this is a key question. I'm sure that within your Indian context, you do not have problems with saying that the brain constructs its own inner time and space. When you look into the Western side of things, particularly the Anglo-American world, you see that they often consider time and space only in the way of perception and cognition of time and space, but not that the brain has its intrinsic time and space. So that's a key difference. The neuronal correlates of the perception and cognition of time are not the time that's basically outer time and space, not the same as the brain's own intrinsic inner time and space. And recent evidence more and more points towards that. So philosophically, for the experts among you, the distinction between inner outer time and space, obviously, don't need to tell you, that goes back to Immanuel Kant. After all, I'm a good German and follow that tradition. So I don't want to go into detail about this figure here, but I just want to indicate for the empirical people. So we distinguish 4 different temporal spatial mechanisms, explicitly temporal spatial mechanisms, not cognitive or perceptual or sensory or motor or affective mechanism, really basic, how the brain constructs its own inner time and space. That's what we mean by temporal spatial mechanisms. And we have 4 of those temporal spatial mechanisms: temporal spatial nestedness, alignment, expansion, globalization. I will indicate that I will provide some flesh to the bones in the following, just to give you an idea. And the idea is that these 4 different mechanisms are also associated with different dimensions of consciousness, meaning, level, state, content, of form. That's very important. The form, organization of consciousness, which obviously again goes back to Immanuel Kant, then phenomenological features, and then cognitive processing. And I think what is important that these 4 mechanisms. So let me give you some idea about the first mechanism, temporal spatial nestedness, and the level and state of consciousness. So meaning I'm going into this one, and here indeed the spontaneous brain activity plays a key role, and we consider this what we call a neural predisposition of consciousness, a necessary non-sufficient condition of possible consciousness. So it's a latent variable which doesn't actually realize consciousness, but without it, you can never realize consciousness. So this is very important. It's a necessary condition of possible consciousness. And of course, you see, as philosophers, you immediately see there's a sort of transcendental-like background, of course, going back to my Kantian heritage. So let me go a little bit into the brain dynamics. So what do I mean by dynamics? Dynamics describes the pattern of in the changes from time point to time point. So it's not just one time point x plus 1, x plus 2, x plus 3. No, it is the relative change from time point to time point, from T1 to T2 to T3. And that sounds trivial to you because in the Indian tradition, of course, for you, it's no problem to think that in terms of pattern and changes, relative changes over time. It is not trivial because when you go into other cultural tradition, it's a much more focus on the discrete points in time. So how can we operationalize these transitions between points in time, the relative relationship between different time points? So I show you here different ways. One way is, for instance, what we call scale-free activity. It's the power law exponent. You see here on the y-axis, you see the frequency. The x-axis, you see the frequency. On the y-axis, you see the power. And you see the slower the frequency, the larger the power. Yeah, and there's a certain relationship. But what is important, that this relationship holds across all frequencies. So meaning there is what the experts call there's a self-similarity. And I think, I don't know whether I bring it in the next one of the later slides. It's like the Russian dolls. They all have the same shape, but they have different scales. One is larger, one is smaller in the Russian dolls. And the same here with the power spectrum, and that you can measure. You can measure the steepness of this curve. And that basically measures the relationship between the different frequencies and their respective power. And that provides, and you can see there's a certain temporal structure. Yeah, meaning the slower frequencies have more power, the faster frequencies have less power. And that's a certain temporal structure, and the degree of that temporal structure can slightly vary. I will show you in the following. So here I show you now, and that's what you can measure in the frequency spectrum, the power law exponent. It's called the steepness of this curve. It's called scale-free activity. You can measure that. And that's what we did. So here is a very nice study by one of my Chinese postdocs, Jianfeng Zhang, who's now professor in China, in Shenzhen. And he studied here what is called the disorders of consciousness in anesthesia, because obviously in anesthesia you lose consciousness. So the first thing what he did, so he really measured this relationship between slower and faster frequencies, the power law exponent, scale-free activity, and this was done in fMRI. So for the expert, we are here operating in a frequency range between 0.01 Hertz and 0.1 Hertz. So between 100 seconds and 10 seconds. So it's relatively slow, much slower than EEG. And you can see, okay, that the scale-free activity, the steepness of the curve is very much reduced. These are whole brain topographic plots, and you see it's much less here in the anesthetic state. So the interesting thing is now, look at these curves. So this, I'm always, when he presented me that figure, I was really fascinated, because you can really see. So the normal conscious state is that you have more power in the slower frequency, less power in the faster frequencies. However, now look, and that's so there is a certain shape or a certain temporal structure, yeah, in the relationship between frequency and power. However, you see here in anesthesia, that basic structure is no longer given. So it's not just a reduction of your scale-free activity, it's the whole shape, the temporal structure of the power spectrum. The basic organization is disrupted, meaning the nestedness, that slower frequencies nesting the faster frequencies in the same way the larger Russian dole nests or contain the smaller Russian dole. That basic structure, scale-free self-similarity, is lost in anesthesia. So it's basically, if you want to say so, no longer the same brain. Yeah. So that's what you can see here. So it's really, it's no longer the same brain. It has a different temporal structure. And that's why consciousness becomes impossible. Then he did some control investigations with other measures, neuronal activity. And I probably leave that out for the sake of simplicity. And one way, sorry, I think okay, this I did. Good. So when you look at this is a summary slide from a paper which is about to be published. So look, for instance, here, this is done from my co-author here, Federico Cilio, and because he makes such nice figures, one of my other postdocs from Spain, he calls him Federico da Vinci. Okay, so here you can see this is sort of the normal conscious awake state. You can see the different time scales in the wake, second, minute, hours, days, and longer. And they all sort of nested in each other. And that's what you can see here, sort of in the power spectrum. However, now, when you start losing consciousness, for instance, in sleep, your slower frequencies become abnormally strong. So the curve gets steeper. And that's what you can see here. And you can see this also here in the power spectrum. And he symbolized this very nicely here with the Russian dots. Now, and so then meaning also your perception becomes slow. So you perceive your external world and slower, and the faster frequencies are somehow receded. And I think it's beautifully indicated in this one. Then now when you completely lose consciousness, like in surgical anesthesia, your power spectrum is completely flat. What does this mean? Your brain doesn't make a difference anymore between slow and fast frequency. It's all gray. So that's why they don't perceive anything outside anymore. They're not conscious because everything is the same. I always imagine it's like a big soup where everything disappears and you cannot, there's no differentiation. There's no temporal differentiation, there's no spatial differentiation. So it's blank. Yeah, and I think Federico da Vinci, as I said, or Celio in real name, beautifully indicated that here. Yeah. Interestingly, so this is a temporal nestedness. We have also spatial nestedness, that the global brain activity nests or contain the regional level, and then the local level, the cellular level. And that spatial nestedness is also lost in consciousness. We had another paper, 2020, Tanabe et al., on exactly that, where the degree of the loss of spatial nestedness / global signal topography, as measured by global signal topography in fMRI, was lost and predicted the level of consciousness. So that's what we assume. So it's really the relationship between different time scales. It's the relationship between different spatial scales. That's what we mean by temporal spatial nestedness. And that is key for the level and state of consciousness. So let me indicate the second mechanism, which is even more key and is particular key for the philosophical relevance of the TTC. Why do I say this? In order for something neuroscientifically to be relevant philosophically, like epistemologically or ontologically for existence, reality, or for knowledge, we need to link the brain intrinsically to the world, because epistemology and ontology are about the world. Yeah. So, and this is the of this second mechanism, temporal spatial alignment. What do I mean by alignment? When you hear music, you unconsciously tap with your feet to the rhythm of the music. Or when I do these movements, you might detect yourself that you might do movements in similar rhythm with your hands, or that you also start nodding. I often observe this when I have my patients, my psychiatric patients via Zoom, that suddenly we do exactly the same thing. It's like mirroring. Yeah. And of course, it's unconscious. There's no voluntary, deliberate control over it. So the question is, and that is a key question of our approach to consciousness, and I think it makes it really unique compared to all other theory. The brain needs to synchronize, align itself to its environmental context. That's what I mean by alignment. So alignment, synchronization with the environment, entrainment, is basically the brain actively adapts its own rhythm and spatial, inner spatial structure to the outer temporal and spatial structure of the environment. Music is, of course, perfect. And by that alignment or adaptation, the brain uses its own intrinsic timescales. So we mean that these intrinsic timescales, so the brain has not only one timescale, it has different timescales. We can measure them with what is called autocorrelation function or window. And you also see in the brain, it's not only one timescale, they have multiple scales, timescales, and different regions have different timescales. These were two papers which we published this year, was done by a doctoral student of mine from Iran, Meshat Golozauki, and we published these two papers. And this is a key, this is a figure from the paper in Nature Communication Biology this year. So here you see the brain has different timescales and has a repertoire of different kinds, and these timescales that match with the timescales of the environment. Paradigmatic example, music. When you listen to Indian music, because your brain is very familiar to it, so the timescales of the brain, probably the brain recruits corresponding timescales that are similar present in the music. And so that's a sort of a stochastic matching process of environmental and neural timescales. So the brain intrinsic timescales, which can be, for instance, measured by the autocorrelation function, may correspond to the timescales of the world. Not 100%. There's always a certain discrepancy. And that discrepancy, and obviously there's a discrepancy because the world has much longer timescales, when the longest is evolution, than the brain. So there's always a discrepancy that the smaller timescales, the smaller range of the timescales of the brain somehow need to adapt to the larger ranges of timescales of the world. And of course, the brain tries to get as much information even from those timescales beyond its own range. Yeah. So, and that's key. So there's an active alignment, active adaptation of the brain to the timescales of the environment. And I think the best example is music, but also when you have together with other people. So this is now the question is, are the timescales changed, the brain's timescale changed when you lose consciousness? So this is a paper came out this year by Federico Ciglio, the son of Da Vinci in Italy. And actually it's very interesting. He's both. He's a philosopher and a neuroscientist and really does both things excellent. So here, and I want to draw your attention to this. So this is EEG, sleep, and just focus here. ACW means autocorrelation window. And you can see that the autocorrelation window becomes longer and longer in when you get deeper into sleep in REM 3. What does this mean? So your brain no longer has shorter time scales to pick up the faster stimuli in the environment when you sleep. So it integrates everything into the longer time scales. So meaning the perception is no longer as differentiated in its time scales as when you're in the awake state. So meaning if you lose the fine-grained temporal differentiation of faster time scales, you lose the fine-grained relation and perception of your environmental context. So meaning things become more the same. Remember the dark picture I showed you for the temporal spatial nestedness, here also for the, and then of course, the brain cannot properly align or synchronize with the faster time scale of the environment. So, and here, so this is here for sleep. Then we show this also different for anesthesia, sevoflurane. This is surgical anesthesia, then also here for ketamine. But you see also the difference. Ketamine, they still have consciousness. It's an altered state of consciousness. Yeah. Then the question was, is this really related to input processing? Because alignment is obviously related to the brain's input processing. Then Federico came up with a very brilliant idea. Okay, I investigate also patients with a locked-in syndrome and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis who can't move, where the motor output is disturbed, but they still have consciousness. So assumption is here, maybe the input processing is still preserved, but the output processing is disturbed. And because they have consciousness, then their time scale / their autocorrelation function should be normal. And that's exactly what he observed. You see the autocorrelation window of the locked-in syndrome people here. This is the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a very terrible motor disease, are still preserved. They're not longer than in the healthy subject. So that sort of is an indirect suggestion that when you lose your time scales, your input processing is no longer preserved, meaning you lose your temporal spatial alignment. This is the overview figure, which I think is very nice. You see the time scales in the input processing of the disorders of consciousness become abnormally long, abnormally slow, and then basically you integrate everything. You cannot temporally segregate anymore, and that means you cannot make any temporal differentiation, meaning everything becomes the same and you're gradually losing consciousness. World is one big black box. I think that's the way I imagine it. Now we are trying also to reconstruct these subjective perceptual images from the neuronal activity to make understand how they really perceive. Yeah, so that's basically, and here, this is another very nice figure of Federico, which will come out in the paper soon. Temporal spatial alignment and the form or structure of consciousness. So imagine if you have fine-grained time scales, faster and slower one, you can really make a nice differentiation between the different stages of the runner. Here he starts running, and then he runs. Yeah, this is Usain Bolt, as you can see. And however, if your timescales become abnormally long, you may integrate the different timescales. I don't know how I can make this away. I don't know whether you, yeah, okay, let me put this here. You can see that it becomes blurry because you integrate this time point, you integrate all these three times 200 milliseconds into one big time scale, and it becomes blurry. So you have, and ultimately, what is this guy doing? You have no idea because you cannot temporally differentiate. I think it's a very nice illustration. And now we're actually really trying to investigate this kind of blurriness. Let me go to the next slide. And I probably skip the third mechanism of consciousness in favor of time because I don't want to stretch it too much, temporal spatial expansion and the consciousness, content of consciousness. So I leave that out. You can read that in the paper. The only thing I think it's really a key that here's a spontaneous brain activity interacts with the stimulus, and that interaction is the temporal spatial interaction. Let me just skip all that. This is a very nice summary slide which was done by Federico, and one key is if these four temporal spatial mechanisms of consciousness as postulated in this TTC are empirically plausible, they should allow for clinical differentiation. What does this mean? They should allow that we can distinguish and make a differential diagnostic of different states of consciousness. And you see, he did this, visualize that very nicely. Temporal spatial alignment is one mechanism, temporal spatial nestedness, that's the two ones I showed you, temporal spatial expansion, the content of consciousness, and here the axis globalization of consciousness. And then he plotted the different states of consciousness here, and I think that they can really be distinguished by a different relationship between these four mechanisms. So now, next step here, of course, that we need to more formalize it. We need to put some mathematical formalization to this, which actually we did in an initial paper, 2020 or 19, using category theory of mathematics. So let me, I think this is the end, basically, of the temporal spatial theory of consciousness, the empirical, and I have about, as I can see here on the watch, about almost 50 minutes left. So now I come to the more philosophical issues. One first step is that you can see that we really say we do not go for these different forms of neuroscience, cognitive, affective, sensory-motor, social neuroscience, which are about brain function. We say that the key for mental features lies in the temporal dynamic and the spatial topography of the brain. So this is what I try to indicate with this rudimentary figure, and for that is the spontaneous activity. So what we say, we speak of spatial temporal neuroscience. Spatial temporal neuroscience basically has two main features. First, it really describes the temporal dynamic and the spatial topography of the brain itself in a purely neuronal terms. But the most important feature is that we assume that these topographical and dynamic features organize a key for mental features. That's where neuronal and neuronal phenomenal hypotheses converge. So I probably leave that out. Yeah, what is important that you see really, and that's a first step towards philosophy, you see really a different view of the brain. Traditionally, the brain is conceived in cognition. Here, I conceive the brain in terms of experience on the spatial temporal side. Second, there are input cognition output relationship in cognitive neuroscience as an extension of the behavior approach, behaviorism. And instead, we talk of spatial temporal relationship, like the relationship between different regions, between global, local brain activity, between slow and fast frequencies. We do not look for single inputs or stimuli, but we look for the organization and the structure. Yeah, for the dynamic structure of, for instance, the music, the temporal dynamics of the music. Yeah, and we do not conceive the brain, particularly in terms of information processing primarily, but we conceive it in terms of processing different time and space scales, larger and smaller scales. Yeah, so meaning topography instead of regions or networks, and dynamics instead of single frequencies. So that, as to my understanding, has huge implication for ontology. Because what we consider here is basic temporal dynamics, spatial topography are basic constituents which are also present in nature, in the natural world. Yeah. You see topographic structure, look at sand dunes, you see sample dynamics nested within each other, seismic earth waves and things like that. The ocean waves I indicated. So, and that means here I'm already very easily can connect the empirical domain to the ontological domain. What do I mean by ontology? Existence and reality in the natural world. Yeah, and in order to be ontologically relevant, I need to go beyond the brain itself and intrinsically connect the brain to the world. Remember, temporal spatial alignment is one empirical mechanism for that. So this is very important. Also, I do not consider ontology a subset of metaphysics, as often conceived in the Western world, because metaphysics is basically the logical world. But the logical world is by definition, at least in the Western tradition, by definition atemporal and aspatial. So for me, ontology is really about space and time, existence of time and space in the world. Okay, let me get, and then you have this. This is from the New Yorker. That's a nice thing. So, and I want to say, how does the temporal spatial theory of consciousness stand to the mind-body problem? Okay, let me go to the next thing. This is basically what I published in this book some years ago, and I still now develop this. Okay, let me put this down here. I don't know, this is really stubbornly resistant. Okay. How can we describe the existence and reality / ontology of world and brain? And that really leads you back to the basics of ontology. First, traditional and Western philosophy, I explicitly emphasize Western philosophy because you will not you don't see this as much in your Indian philosophy context and also in the more even Chinese philosophy context. It's an element-based ontology. Specific properties or substances as the most basic features of existence and reality. Elements are primary, relations are secondary. So this is really important. So, and you see this. The Cartesian ontology is, of course, an element-based ontology. The current neuroscientific approaches to consciousness, IIT, integrated information theory, and others are really element-based, presuppose an element-based ontology. However, okay, there's an alternative, which in the Western tradition is more on the sidelines. It's a relation-based ontology. One paradigmatic example is Alfred North Whitehead, process ontology, one step. Another one, and the more recently, is from the French tradition, Gilles Deleuze, but usually it's more on the sidelines. And that's the relation are the basic features of existence and reality. Relation is primary and the elements come out of it. I give you a more concrete example. I would say that the regions, the distinction between different regions is a result of their underlying functional connectivity, and that in turn goes back to the global brain activity, which is distributed in different degrees in different regions. The distinction between different regions is secondary to the primary global holistic activity of the brain, meaning differentiation into different regions is a secondary process of an underlying, more basic global process. Remember, you saw the different frequencies. The distinction between the different frequencies is a secondary, maybe even not even ontological, it's an epistemological or methodological feature of us who cannot cope with this whole power spectrum, so we distinguish into different frequencies. But the main thing is the basic shape of this frequency. That's a relation-based ontology. In current Western philosophy, you see it in structural realism. That's what I argued also in my book. So let me illustrate that. And I know I'm running out of time. So here you have I need to do this here in my other. So here, this is the primacy of elements over relation, and then secondary relations are integrated. And that's different in relation-based ontology. Here you have first a relation, and then you have the distinction between different regions. That's basically. So the question is, you see here for the element-based ontology, mind and body are different elements. Yeah, so that's the question of the mind-body problem. That's the question underlying the possibility / conceivability of the mind-body problem. Are there different properties or substances associated with mind and body? And even if you then say, no, they are not, you still presuppose this question, because without that question, you could have not given your answer. So philosophically speaking, it's a transcendental-like argument what I'm doing here. Meaning the element ontology raises a certain question, which in turn limits how you can conceive the relationship between mind and body, namely in terms of elements. Are there two elements or one element? Yeah, are mind and body two elements or one element? That's the basic question underlying the possibility of the mind-body problem. However, in the context of a relation-based ontology, mind and body are just two different aspects of a more basic underlying process with relation and structure. So you cannot even raise the question, are there two different elements? Because that's nonsensical in the context of relation-based ontology, because there are already, there's an underlying relation. So then, of course, the question now, as a neurophilosopher, as a non-reductive philosopher, I'm asking the question, which ontology holds and is empirically plausible? The element-based ontology of mind and body, or the relation-based ontology? Remember, the stochastic matching, temporal spatial alignment, and because that's what I say, the brain's intrinsic neural timescale allow the brain to relate to the world. And the brain needs to adapt its smaller timescale to the larger timescale of the world. So you have what I call a world-brain relation. It's not a brain-world relation, because that means the brain is primary. No, the world is primary, and the brain and its timescale is a differentiation within the world. It's like a smaller Russian doll within the larger Russian doll called world. So that's why I speak world-brain relation, and this is compatible with a relation-based ontology. Meaning, I would argue temporal spatial alignment and its necessity for consciousness provides empirical plausibility, empirical support to the assumption of world-brain relation and its key importance for mental features. That's what I speak of world-brain relation. The brain is an integral part of the natural world and its time and space. Meaning the brain's inner time and space can be seen ontologically as a differentiation of the temporal spatial, ongoing temporal spatial differentiation of the world. And that is manifest within what I empirically describe as spatial topography and temporal dynamic. And so meaning the smaller timescales of the brain, yes, are integrated within the larger timescales of the world. And I bring here two examples. Finally, this is a picture on the Russian dolls I was owing to you. Yeah, you see the smaller are integrated within the larger. And of course, you have something like that in your Indian tradition too. I don't know. I only know it from the Chinese tradition. There's this beautiful crystal ball. You see the same shapes in different scales, much more beautifully manufactured from the Russians. So I hope you don't tell that the Russians is what I said here. Good. So that's what I call world-brain relation. And that is important. So there's a spatial temporal nestedness. The brain, time scales and space scales are nested within the larger time scales of the world. And it's the same. So that means there's not only nestedness, but also directedness. Yeah, it goes from the larger Russian doll directly to the smaller Russian doll, not the other way. The smaller Russian doll cannot contain the larger Russian doll. Same here. The brain cannot contain the world. The world-ness can contain the world. And I think that empirically is the temporal spatial alignment, ontologically is the world-brain relation, and that's key for consciousness, and then what we call, and for cognition, and so on. So that's why I said, okay, and I left out many steps. You see in chapter 10, that's a key chapter in that Spontaneous Brain, the 2018 book, where makes a proof of the necessary relationship between world and brain, and that the world-brain relationship is necessarily related to consciousness. Necessary a posteriori, not necessary a priori. I just want to indicate that for the philosophers among you, because you can only set up an ontological theory of consciousness if you show the necessity. You need to show the necessity, either a priori or a posteriori, of the relationship between world/brain and consciousness. If you cannot show this, you remain contingent. You are not philosophically relevant from my point of view. So how can this poor creature resolve his problem, going beyond the brain over world-brain relation to the world-brain problem? So I say, look, if you presuppose relation-based ontology, you can replace the mind-body problem by what I call the world-brain problem. And then you need to show how the brain is part of the world and related to the world, and how that relationship makes necessary consciousness. And that, of course, is the temporal spatial relationship as fleshed out. So can the world-brain problem replace the mind-body problem? Yes, when you consider the empirical data of temporal spatial theory of consciousness, and if you switch from element-based to relation-based ontology, and now you say, Nordhoff, why shall we do this? This is a strange problem. I don't believe you anything. I tell you very simple, because it's more empirically plausible. The mind-body problem and its element-based ontology might be logically conceivable and logically plausible. Yes, but I would argue the data, in particular the TTC, do not support it. They support a different ontological framework, relation-based ontology and the world-brain problem. Yeah. So you see, and I think it's key, and current philosophy of mind in the Western tradition doesn't do that. You really need to dig deep into the ontological presupposition, and I'm sure you know this very well in your Indian tradition. And for that, so I conclude that temporal spatial theory of consciousness, I hope it's a promising not only empirical candidate, but also a promising ontological candidate for the approach to consciousness without reducing the ontological to the empirical. Yeah, so it's an explicitly non-reductive approach. Thank you very much, and also for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nordhoff, for really leading us. You know, we didn't notice how the time went. From the Cartesian dichotomy through the common currency of the brain and mind, talking about temporospatial dynamics, and how the brain constructs both the inner time and space with the outside world. And you talked about the temporal nestedness of the frequencies, as well as the brain alignment to the environment. The comparison of the EEG waves and the C waves was very, very interesting, as was the Russian dolls. And finally, taking us to the question of whether it's elemental ontology or relation-based ontology of the brain with the outside world. So fascinating. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Indra Devi, to take the discussion forward.
As a neurosurgeon who deals with traumatic brain injuries and brain tumors, which result in altered sensorium and altered cognition, I think we have slightly easier job of understanding the altered sensorium and altered cognition states, because of the purely anatomical and physiological pathways. I think that when you have to interpose an intact brain with intact circuits, and then the altered thinking and altered consciousness and cognition, I think it is much more complicated. And maybe the interposition of philosophy and nested nets and all these things will help understand it in a better way. Thank you for trying to take us through the journey of understanding this.
Yeah, thank you for the, I just briefly comment because you're a neurosurgeon. I'm sure you have often the observation that the same location of a tumor, probably even the same size, leads to completely different cognitive affective disturbances.
Yes.
And I would argue that's the degree to which the tumor changes the spatial topography and temporal dynamics of your brain. So for instance, more concrete in fMRI, I would like to see global signal topography. And I would like to see the kind of power law exponent, what we did here.
Yeah.
And I would expect that is probably more directly related to the symptoms of the patients.
Yeah, see, you know what, one of our senior neurosurgeons, Dr. Albert Roton, he is no more. He used to tell that brain is awesome, but it is unforgiving. So no, I think that if we keep both these things together, I think we can try to understand the concepts of consciousness and cognition. And how the different patients react to different sizes of the tumor. A large tumor and in a critical area, it doesn't, I mean, the patient is intact. But at the end of surgery, where you have toiled hard throughout the day and night and then remove the tumor, and then the patient is in altered states.
Yeah, very interesting. So we indeed now also try to apply this temporal spatial approach also to diagnostic differential diagnosis. I indicated that there we see locked-in syndrome,
Yes.
and also for therapeutic evaluation. Yeah, so yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I'm a big fan of neurosurgery because you can really go into the brain and let's say impact with deep brain stimulation the different frequencies. That's what I would ideally love to do. Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's how this, if you see locked-in syndrome versus akinetic mute, then you are really, really amazed, you know. A small area like brainstem can still contain the consciousness, whereas a larger supratentorial region with a small area supplied by the anterior communicating artery, it just goes, then the patient is an akinetic mute, and you cannot even rehabilitate the person properly.
Yeah, I agree completely. My hope is that we can do also similar things in the future, not only single region brain stimulation, but larger areas, whole territories, that we can reset some of their topography and of their frequencies, because it's clear psychiatric disorders, I don't need to tell you, these are not disorders of single regions or single networks. Yeah, all these approaches have yielded nothing. Yeah, no differential diagnostic marker. Yeah, even within the same disease, the networks are not consistent. Yeah. So that's one of the backgrounds of this unorthodox approach, what I'm doing, because I'm also a clinical psychiatrist and see that, yeah, the current models are insufficient. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We'll try to take a few questions from the chat box if it is there.
I don't see any questions in the chat box, sir.
Somebody has raised the...
There are 4 tabs.
Please go ahead.
Madhvi can unmute and ask the question.
Can you hear me? Yes. So I was just wondering if you looked at the PLE and those kind of calculations in the context of neurofeedback.
Yeah, very good question. Complex PTSD. I mean, one key symptom of PTSD is dissociation, and I would do the same thing, and you will see this in some of our papers. I reconstruct psychiatric symptoms as basic spatial temporal disturbances. So I would argue, we have one paper on dissociation 2020, Andrea Scalabrini, very neuroscientist and psychoanalyst actually. We did this together, and basically we assume, for instance, in dissociation. So what do you experience in dissociation? You experience a certain mental contents of yours no longer belong to yourself. That's a very rough, of course I know dissociation, but it's typically in PTSD. I mean, you know, this is flashbacks and all this kind of thing. And we assume that that is due to the lack of spatial integration in the topography. So different regions, different networks are on different scales, no longer integrated within the other, meaning neuronal activity within a single region is not properly integrated, meaning integrated, linked and synchronized with each other. Then regions and networks are not properly synchronized with each other, and then the global activity is no longer properly synchronized with the regional activity. So, and what happens if your brain does not properly synchronize in its different spatial scales? The contents become isolated, and that's what you experience in dissociation. So dissociation here in part, as one key symptoms of complex PTSD, is a lack of spatial integration across different scales. So now, of course, the even more interesting question is, how can we treat that? And that's something, that's why I'm mentioning, remember I mentioned in my response to the neurosurgeon, I would not like to have only one single electrode as deep brain stimulation, but a whole array of electrodes, so that I can really, let's say, and put them in such a frequency that the different regions can better synchronize with each other and integrate their respective content so that you don't need to dissociate anymore. Yeah, so, and you will see this, we are trying to develop a differential diagnostic of different spatial and temporal mechanisms underlying the different symptoms in psychiatric disorders. Yeah, and then we hope that that provides a diagnosis and differential diagnosis. Yeah.
Yeah. So my sense was that based on your theory, whatever you presented this time, the current practice of neurofeedback that goes on and a lot of work that's going on seems too simplistic. It isn't necessarily capturing the dimensions that are required.
Yeah, very good point. And it's interesting. Sorry. Oh, sorry. You want to continue? Sorry.
No, that's it. That's it. Just
okay.
a comment.
It's interesting. At the end of my question, I sensed I forgot something to answer, but I didn't know what. So now I know what. The feedback. Yeah, I completely agree. Of course, I'm all for neurofeedback, but the problem for me, it's primarily cognitive. Yeah, it's based on cognitive contents. What I want the neurofeedback acting upon the spatial topography and the temporal dynamics. The problem of that is all unconscious. So you basically would need a continuous online monitoring of your temporal dynamics and then record that with your BCI device and then provide, let's say, a slightly faster feedback so that your frequencies in the brain become faster. So basically, I imagine a spatial temporal BCI rather than the current cognitive BCI.
Thank you.
Dr. Narthop, there could be some questions directly to you in your chat box. Would be able to select the questions.
Yeah, I can, if you want, I can read it. So there's one here. Okay, let me just, according to structure matching thesis, time has the privileged property of being common between structure and content. But I'm curious in terms of space, what is common between content and structure? Yeah, very good question. and you already just went right into the weak point. How do you operationalize or conceive spatial features on the mental level? However, I think you can, because you subjectively, let's say we had just this morning, actually, we saw a patient here together in Izmir, and often schizophrenic patients, they cannot orient themselves in space. So objectively, of course, they know, okay, the office is there, the room is there, the door is there. Cognitively, they know, but they do not find the way. Why? Because they lack the subjective, they cannot put themselves, their own position, relative to the rest of the room and the space where they find the door or whatever. So meaning they lack a subjective spatial experience, meaning they lack a mental topography of space. And the mental topography is not the same as the objective physical space. Yeah, very interesting. One of my other postdocs in Portugal, Felipe, he is also a psychoanalyst and does a PhD with me. And he always says that many of his psychotic patients, they know exactly where his praxis, his office is, but they cannot find the way. They're lost. So they need to call and then they need to be guided. Yeah, because they do not have, let's say, a subjective geographic topographic map in space, which of course we are not conscious of that because we are just automatically acting upon it. Yeah, so I think that would be one common feature between neuronal and mental in terms of the spatial. So that's why I speak of topography, and admittedly, and you're absolutely right, I'm extremely unspecific. I need to specify, I need to have different mechanism of topography. Give me some time, you can imagine it's already a lot of work. Yeah. Yeah. Let me see, there's some other question. PTSD, did. Yeah, here there's a very nice comment. At times we feel expanded or contracted. When something is boring, we feel time moves slowly. Exactly that. And your thoughts also become slow. Yeah. So that means when my talk was completely boring for you, the 1 hour felt like 2 hours. And you say, oh my gosh, is this guy boring? Yeah. And so that's your brain. That's the frequency, the temporal dynamics of your brain, which plays you a trick. Yeah, so you have a mismatch between the objective physical time and the subjective mental time. And the intermediate, what is shared, that's what I would assume is your inner time of the brain. Why? Because maybe you're not interested in the topic, because your brain only processes what it really interested in. What for the brain is not interesting, it doesn't process. It's no interest. It may process this, but it's just discard it. Yeah. And we all know this as psychiatrists. I mean, you know this more than well. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's that's subjective time. And my question is, where is this coming from? Yes, the brain itself has its own subjective time as compared to the objective time of the world, meaning you have a mismatch between the time of the world and the time of the brain. Yeah. Yeah. And there's some other question, which what is the treatment for people with gender dysphoria? It's hard because I have no expertise in that. Is homosexuality a treatable condition? I think I will not answer that for reasons some of you might understand. So meaning it's not a condition, hence it doesn't need to be treated. Yeah, this is of course an Indian question here. Consciousness diluted, can it be integrated or reconstructed through mindfulness meditation? Of course, I should not answer this question in the Indian context, but nevertheless, I will tell you a little bit. Of course, as you can see, I'm fascinated in all kinds of mental states, whatever. That's why I became a psychiatrist. And I'm still fascinated. I mean, whatever phenomenon comes, it's just like a little boy. I find unbelievable what our brain can bring forward. So here, and of course, meditation is a paradigmatic example. I'm sure you know this. There's this notion of non-dual awareness, so that you basically you do not experience your own self anymore. And the Western tradition then often says, oh, they lose their self. No, I would say they just go to a deeper layer to exactly this alignment layer. Yeah, where you aligned, where the brain activity is strongly matched with the environmental activity, and the self doesn't dissociate so much the brain from the rest of the environment. So that's, and that when you look, and we looked in a study for long-term meditators, proficiency, what does change in their dynamic and in their topographical structure. So the whole brain becomes topographically reorganized. That the distinction between default mode network and executive network is no longer as strong. They're more positively rather than negatively related. And so the whole brain is really reorganized. So that's why we developed a topographical reorganization model of meditation, particularly of this non-dual awareness. And yes, so obviously, and that gives you, aligns you more with the environment. And I think that's what you experience in meditation, because you experience a sense of unity. Yeah, you're no longer as distinct from the environment. But of course, tentatively, because you guys are the experts here. So I should not talk about this.
Dr. Northoff, what you said about relativity reminded me of on a lighter note, that when you sit on a hot radiator, a second seems like an hour. But if you're sitting with your arm around a person you love, an hour seems like a second. So I think that's really in terms of the subjective experience that, you know, that makes you kind of.
Yeah, beautiful example. That's what counts for me. Neurological disorders affecting spatial cognition, hemi-neglect syndrome, similar there, spatial time perception gets impaired. Do such groups provide a test ground for your theory? Very good question. My answer, no. Because these are disorders of spatial perception and spatial cognition. These are not primary disorders of space and time construction by the brain itself. And that's, I think, are psychiatric disorders. In psychiatric disorders, the time and space within the brain itself is abnormally constructed, and that in turn affects your perception of outer time and space. But they are primarily disorders of the inner time and space of the brain itself. Whereas in these neurological disorders, the inner time and space of the brain construction, the basic principles of which are preserved. I would argue that. Yeah. That's why I became a psychiatrist and a neurologist. How would one integrate neurotransmitter disturbances resulting in altered time perception in the model? Good question. One transmitter is indeed dopamine, which has been related. You see it also in Parkinson's disorder. Dopamine, they experience slowness. D2 receptors, substantia nigra ventral tegmental area. And we indeed did this also in bipolar disorder, where we looked for subcortical nuclear dopamine, serotonin, roughened nuclei, and see how they're related to cortical. So definitely I would argue yes. How exactly the relationship is between particular time disturbances and transmitter remains to be explored. I wanted to ask a question about the constraints on the brain that it is temporal falls within certain value. Is it slower scales constrain the faster, larger scales? Yes. Good question. Exactly. If you don't have the slower scales, the faster scales cannot be nested. Yeah, there's no such empirical data because usually the faster frequencies recede and the slower frequencies remain. So, but the opposite case, that you have faster frequencies preserved, slower frequencies, you do not have in conditions. Because that tells you it's really a basic feature of the brain, these slow frequencies. So that's where you need computational modeling. So you can try to model a brain with just faster frequencies, but no slow frequencies. I would argue that's no longer a brain. Yeah, because the basic structure is here. So, and that's these ranges constrain the illusion of the brain as a system. Exactly that I would say, because these slow frequencies are very long cycle duration. They provide the strongest interface with your environment. If you do not have that interface with the environment, you cannot align anymore. goodbye. Yeah. How would one? Yeah, I already have that. Yeah, and I think that's all the question in the chat here, as far as I can see.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nathan.
So, Dr. Narthoff, it was an amazing afternoon for us. And so all of us, I'm very sure, mentally we were in tune, in time with you, and really, we didn't really feel, okay, that the 1 hour has just passed with the sense of just for a couple of minutes. So we thank you very much for your greater insights for the new theory that you have proposed to understand consciousness in both normal and as well as in the abnormal the conditions. So we look forward again for the further interactions with you from the NIMHANS. So, and I also thank the Director Madam for chairing this session, and also our Dean Indra Devi Madam for co-chairing this session. And I also thank all the participants who have logged in. So thank you very much once again on the behalf of Center for Consciousness Studies. Thank you. And
thank you. And I hope we can meet at some point in person or interact in other ways that I can learn from your tradition. Yeah.
Sure, definitely. We will have that closed group meeting, maybe, which is mutually convenient time for both of us. That we will do it. Good. So thank you very much. And again, we will meet for our evening session at 6:30. And again, we have a very interesting session. His mind is there in a minimal conscious and anesthetic state. With again, experts joining.